There we go. Welcome, and thanks so much for having me back again to speak at the Qualaware user group. And I am watching the chat. So if you have any questions while I'm presenting, please put them in the chat. And if I can weave it into my presentation, I will. Otherwise, we'll get to those questions at the end. But I know it's handy when you have a question just to pop it in before you forget. So do that. I am watching the chat. All right, so my topic tonight, Agile, digital transformation, and change management, insights from neuroscience. So I'm going to talk about an example, a case study. It was actually part of my PhD research. That was initially, it was about digital transformation, but we didn't actually get to the digital part. We spent a lot of time on the transformation part, which was great. And I'm sure many of you have probably been part of digital transformations in the past. I know I certainly have. That really have been a lot of emphasis on the digital, and they ended up being digital installations, not transformations, which can cause a lot of challenges afterwards. So change management, why do we need to think about change management? Interesting, Harvard Business Review published an article, probably at least last year, that says, change management is for all managers. And I think that's true. Change is, everything we're doing now is change. And so everybody really needs to understand what causes resistance to change, what causes ourselves, others to resist change. It's when you understand that, it's very helpful no matter what you do, whether you're a business analyst, an enterprise architect, business architect, it's very useful. So let me just talk a little bit more about digital transformation. What do I really mean about that? Because that word is thrown around a lot. And really, all it means is implementing digital technology and new ways of doing work to work better or to deliver better service or to deliver new services or products using digital technology. But the key around the term digital transformation is it's not the technology that's being transformed. Technology is being replaced or installed. So if you're going from paper to digital, that is fresh 100% technology installation. What is being transformed is the way that we work, the way that we interact with each other, the way that we interact with the tools that we use, the way that we interact with our customers, our clients, etc. That is what is being transformed, the way that we make decisions. The way we make decisions is a big part of digital transformation because we now have a lot more data to use to make informed decisions, both operational decisions and strategic decisions. So that is what I mean by digital transformation, and it's actually not really new. It's been going on for quite a few decades. We just didn't call it that. So let me tell you, first of all, about the case study or the research project that I was involved in, and I'm going to refer to this and weave this throughout my presentation. So this particular one was the inpatient service for stroke rehab. So essentially, when people leave the acute care of stroke and they go to rehab, but they're still in a hospital, it's a rehab hospital, it's not an acute care hospital. Many people who have serious strokes will go into an inpatient rehabilitation for often 6 weeks to 3 months before they then move to outpatient. So this was the inpatient stroke rehab. So it's quite different than acute care. There are a lot of people involved, and it truly is a multidisciplinary service. So there are physicians, nurses, physiotherapists, occupation therapists, speech therapists, psychologists, nutritionists, recreation therapists, And then also there's the patients and the patient's family, because they are also involved in the rehabilitation. It's not like just going for surgery or something and stuff is done to you. Actually, patients and the family are involved in the rehabilitation. And the challenge with this particular stroke rehab that they were having was, although they did have a multidisciplinary team in formally in name, and each team member or group of team members were very skilled and specialized and very committed to their specialty, they did not work well as an integrated team. And they had quite different ways of working. So obviously the nurses were shift working. The physicians, there was 3 or 4 of them, and they were part-time. They had other responsibilities. The physiotherapists and occupation therapists, they were a team, 2 teams of people. They worked 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. The speech therapists, the psychologists, the nutritionists also worked 9 to 5, as did the recreation therapists, Monday to Friday. So quite different work situations as well. And as you, I'm sure, can even imagine, even if you don't know a whole lot about healthcare, there's a lot of difference between, say, a psychologist and a speech therapist in terms of what they focus on and how they operate. So it was a real challenge, although they did operate as a team, and they would meet regularly as a team. They were not really a very cohesive team. It was a challenge, and they had friction, and they had communication challenges, and also they were still doing paper charting. So, because their hospital information system was very much designed for acute care, not for rehab care, which has a lot more note-taking and less monitoring of vital signs, etc. So they were still doing paper charting. So they were on their way to thinking about becoming digital, but they had a lot of challenges. And so they had a new manager came in, and in the midst of the research, a new director came in as well. What they really wanted to do, what the new manager really wanted to do, and the old director was part of this as well, is help them, empower them more as a team. There'd been some other issues as well around changes that hadn't gone well. And so they wanted them to really lead the change and determine how they would change, what they would change first. But again, nobody really knew a whole lot about transformation. They had had a lot of negative situations, negative experiences in the last 5 years. They had tried to make a few changes. One had been successful and the rest had not. So lots of challenges. Their 2 biggest challenges, which are the most common challenges in any kind of transformation, including digital, were inertia and distrust. A lot of change resistance comes from either inertia or distrust. And so they were starting off with a lot of change resistance, even though everybody was in agreement that they wanted to change, that they wanted to start being more digital, that they wanted to work better as a team. At the same time, there was a lot of inertia. No one actually wanted to start talking about change. And I'm sure you've probably maybe have seen that cartoon where there's all these people and there's this leader saying, who wants change? And everybody's putting up their hand. And then the leader says, who wants to change? And nobody's putting up their hand. Everyone's kind of looking down at the ground, hoping they're not noticed. That essentially is the definition of inertia. We actually don't want to change. We want to change, but we don't want to change. Sort of a conflict. But essentially what it means is it's really hard to get people engaged and involved. So they were starting off at a great disadvantage. They wanted to have this grassroots change, but the grassroots didn't want to participate. And a big reason for that, a co-reason with inertia, is distrust. And they had a lot of distrust. They had distrust of leadership. They had distrust of each other. And it also turns out that they had distrust of themselves. They actually didn't trust that they could get along as a team and come up with something without a lot of friction. And everybody was already in a state of that they were somewhat short-staffed. So people were basically already working as much as they could, putting as much energy as they could into their work. And the thought of entering into more conflict or stress to try and get something changed was just too much. So that was the context. And so today I want to zoom into this idea of inertia and distrust because it is becoming more and more prevalent, especially with, we've seen it especially more with the pandemic. Not that the pandemic has caused more distrust in others necessarily, but it actually has increased inertia. And the reason for that is because people are cognitively depleted. We have all had to use so much more cognitive energy to figure out how to work from home. Now we're trying to figure out how to work hybridly. Plus, we're trying to figure out how to live in a pandemic world, and everybody is in a different situation with more or less risk. We're having to make a lot of decisions every day, remember to wear a mask or not, all these things which we never had to do before. All of those things are now conscious decisions we have to make, which burns up cognitive energy. So everybody has even less mental energy available for change. So what can we do about that? And what can we do in this situation? And I want to show you how we used a combination of Agile, not Scrum, not Kanban, but the Agile philosophy, as well as some visual modeling from enterprise architecture and some basic change management techniques. So let's dive into that. So if we look a little bit more around inertia, fundamentally what fuels inertia is this perception that the value is less than the cost. And cost being cost of effort, cost of time, which is related to effort. But the biggest cost for change for people, not necessarily for the organization, but for people, is effort. And the rewards actually have to be fairly substantive to be worth the effort. And we've all experienced this. How many of us have made New Year's resolutions to be more active or to eat more healthily or take up a new instrument, whatever, various things, and we don't actually end up doing it. It's because the reward often is in the future, the effort is right now, and we're not sure that really the reward is worth the effort. And then on top of that, we have this thing called all humans have, which is a present bias, which means what we're experiencing right now gets a lot more weight in our mind than the future. So what that means is the current effort is given a lot more weight in our minds than a future reward. And this is just a natural human condition, and we all think this way. So inertia is fundamentally fueled by this value cost equation, which is influenced by whether it's occurring in the present or in the future. And our choice to remain inert, our weighing of present effort more than future reward is often done unconsciously. We don't even really think it through consciously. And the reason we do this is because our brain is actually wired to conserve mental energy. So anything that's going to take a lot of mental energy, and especially if we have a cognitively demanding job, that's going to be weighed as a high cost in our mind. So why is our brain wired to conserve mental energy, and what does that actually mean? There's some really interesting insights from neuroscience on this. But essentially, how we make decisions and how we decide what to do is a function of neural paths in our mind, especially for things that are repeated, that we've done before. So when you learn something, when you learn how to ride a bike, when you learn how to play an instrument, when you learn how to drive a route to work, a neural path is created in your brain. When you learn how to, do a stroke rehab assessment, right? When you learn how to create a plan, when you learn how to do all the various things that you do in your work, neural paths are created so that you don't have to take a lot of mental energy to think about it all the time. And so the way this happens is that there's a triggering cue that sets off that neural path. So there's some kind of trigger that's saved, and then our brain knows, okay, when that happens, we do this. And we have a memorized action based on that triggering cue so that we don't even think about it anymore. And, how many of you have, take the same route to work all the time when we were driving to work, and you always take the same exit. And now, you're on your way somewhere. It's pretty much the same route to work, except you don't want to take the exit. You want to continue, and your mind is thinking about something else, and you take the exit without even thinking about it, right? That is triggering cue, exit sign, memorized action, take the exit. That is your neural path in action. And we use neural paths all the time in our work to do familiar things. And this is why the pandemic has put such a stress on our cognitive abilities, because we've had to stop and think about everything before we go in the grocery store, before we get in the car. Do I have my mask? All these things that we had to stop and think because they weren't habits for us. So we're burning up mental energy, and we all have a limited amount of mental energy for the day. So our brain has been wired to build neural paths as much as possible to conserve mental energy, because we all only have a limited amount to spend for each day. So that we want to make sure, way back when, that we have the mental energy to deal with danger, etc. So it's a subconscious thing that causes change resistance, and it actually takes effort to overcome this. It takes a lot of effort to change the action that's based on that triggering cue. Okay, it takes mental effort. No matter how much you want the change, it still takes mental effort. And so this was the situation for our team. They were short-staffed. They were all under a lot of mental stress in a way that, they had highly cognitively demanding jobs to figure out, every patient was different, to figure out the rehab plan for that patient. And they had failed before. So when they evaluated the reward cost in their minds, and many of them did this subconsciously even, it's going to take a lot of effort to even just participate in this change, let alone change what we do. Is that effort worth it? We failed before. What's our chance of failing this time? Pretty high. That makes the effort even less worth it. Plus, I'm overworked, and I just feel too tired to do this. And again, a lot of this is subconscious. Some people will think it through when they have time, but a lot of it is subconscious. So as people thought about the effort to change, the effort to overcome friction and conflict, they had tried to make changes before, it hadn't worked, they couldn't get on the same page. Nobody else wanted to make things worse for anybody. We all want change, but we actually aren't really convinced that the effort is worth it. And that is one of the most fundamental reasons behind change resistance. So what did we do? Well, there's really only two options. One is you decrease the effort, and the other is you increase the reward. Those are really your only two options. Trying to make people more motivated is a complete waste of time. Trying to do rah, rah, rah and whatever is a complete waste of time. Your only two options are to decrease the effort or increase the reward. And making as much of that present as possible, definitely decreasing present effort. And is there any way to actually have some present near-term reward? So this is where Agile comes in. Agile in terms of its basic principles. So again, we didn't use Sprint and we didn't use Kanban, but we used a lot of the Agile principles. So one of the fundamental principles of Agile is frequent smaller steps over a longer duration. Starting people within the process earlier. So getting everybody included at the beginning of the process enables people to be involved for a longer duration without actually making the process longer. And multiple smaller steps, less effort. And so if we look at the four principles of Agile, one is to focus on individuals and interactions, getting people involved. Really involved, not just surveys or whatever, but actually getting people involved. Number two, working business benefits. So in other words, the software development Agile principle is, get working code. It's more important than documentation. But if you bring that up a level to, more than just software development, it's about working business benefits. We want to get working business benefits as soon as possible. That's going to start bringing the reward closer. And then we can combine the third and fourth Agile principles to really talk about evolving co-creation. One of the things that actually generates energy, mental energy, as opposed to depletes it, is having a positive experience co-creating something with other people. So evolving co-creation, which Agile is actually really very much about that. That's the whole point of having your, in scrums, having your product owners involved, bringing that up a level, having the people involved who are actually going to have to make the changes. So those are the Agile principles we want to use. If we look at this framework, the change action framework, which is really a framework that represents the whole strategy to execution process. So framing the future, creating your strategy, deciding, what are we trying to achieve, what's going to change, plotting the path, designing, building, testing, planning how everyone's going to do it, getting people involved, and then reaping the rewards, operating, evaluating, and refining. And if we put an Agile view over this, we overlay all three of these stages. So they're not linear. We actually overlay, reap the rewards, frame the future, plot the path in this framework. They're not linear necessarily. There is some part that's linear, but they also overlap. So we want to try and bring reap the rewards as far forward as possible. We want to try and mix frame the future and plot the path. And, that's very much what Agile enables. You don't have to have it all completely figured out. You can actually learn and figure it out along the way. And that actually reduces a lot of cognitive load. When people, especially healthcare, but anybody who's in a fairly, highly risky job where there's consequences of what they do, when people feel they have to get it all figured out before they start, that creates a lot more stress. Because often it's very difficult to do that, especially in the context of digital transformation, where you're going to actually completely change the way you do things and use completely different tools. There's actually no way for anybody to have it all figured out before they actually try it. It needs to be an iterative process that reduces cognitive load. So that is what, that was the approach that we took to reduce the effort. So the second thing is, okay, so how can we increase the rewards? Well, what actually are rewards for people? And what are the near-term rewards that people can experience? And And a lot of the reward that motivates change actually is intrinsic reward, not necessarily saving time or saving money or things that are way down in the future, but intrinsic reward, things that happen right now. So if we think about this team, some of the rewards that they could experience right away by participating, if we design it appropriately in the frame the future, is to feel heard and valued. There were a number of members of the group who did not feel heard and valued, especially the nurses. To give people strategic thinking skills. So how do we actually think strategically? How do we think about what is it we're trying to achieve, and then evaluate our ideas against what we're trying to achieve, as opposed to, personally, or who's the most influential, etc. Can we actually start developing some skills? Empathy, communication, and collaboration skills. They all had these skills with their patients, but they didn't really have them working that great as a team. And if we could actually start building these skills and building their ability to work as a team right early on, and they can experience this and begin to feel as a better team, operate as a better team, that's a huge reward for them. And it gives them confidence that actually we could do this. And remember at the beginning, I said one of their big challenges was they didn't actually really believe, they didn't trust themselves as a team to be able to do this. Increasing self-awareness, increasing the sense of being trusted, pride of ownership, accomplishment, risk management. There's all kinds of skills and experience that are rewards that are part of the change process that actually start to tip that scale and make this change feel more rewarding. And I could go a lot more into that, but I will just leave it at that. But just to remind everyone that think about, especially for those of you who are business analysts and enterprise architects, are there actually some ways that you can help your clients develop some new skills or improve their skills so that they can actually participate more effectively with less effort? So let's talk about the first stage. What was the biggest challenge that they had to address first? Well, their actual biggest challenge was that nobody agreed what to fix first. They had a lot of challenges, a lot of things that weren't working well. And to even agree on what to focus on first was difficult. They tried to do that before and it hadn't worked. So what we did in this situation was we actually used some enterprise architecture approaches. We built their first visual model, and we never called it enterprise architecture for them. We just called it visual modeling. So we built their first visual model, and you won't be able to necessarily read all of this, and that's fine. It's really small print. It's not necessary that you can read it, but essentially what we did over the period of 2.5 months was we built this model iteratively, and everybody saw the model as it was up until their point in meeting. So for instance, we met first with the managers and identified, based on the different processes in the service, what's your challenge in each process area. And then we met with the nurses, and we met with the nurses in groups of 2 and 3 on a break in the middle of their shift, because that was the only time we could get to meet with them and that they could spare. And so we actually had this diagram on a big board, and everybody came in, they had a look at it, and they had 2 questions. Have a look at this diagram. Any challenges on here, you say, yep, that's a big one for me. Anything you want to add? And those were the 2 questions that everybody got asked. And so they gradually built it. And then we met with the physios, and we showed them what had occurred so far, asked the same 2 questions. And so we ended up with this diagram that identified who was part of which process. So pretty much, everyone was involved in the planned discharge process. The actual clinical people and the patients were involved in the care, but the admin team was involved as part of the assessment and the intake. So this diagram, in one diagram, shows who's involved in what process and what are the challenges that people experience in those different processes, and are there any challenges that cross all the processes. So you can see there's a couple of challenges, like staff can have difficulty to emotionally detach, that goes across 3 processes. Patients and family have unrealistic or misconstrued expectations, goes across all the processes. And then over on the right, we had, what are the key impacts to you? So if you're a nurse, what are the key impacts of these challenges to you? And so you can read across the line and see, this extra conflict with patients and family, increased workload, frustration, wasted energy, decreased job satisfaction. So out of this one model, we have a really good sense of what all the challenges are. Everybody has a good sense, not only their own challenges, but other people's challenges, and even more so how those challenges impact others, which is what helped them decide what should they focus on first. And they decided, we need to focus on the challenge that assessments take too long. This is something that we all agree, it impacts all of us, and it impacts the patient. And they decided, let's pick something that impacts the patient the most first, as well as something that impacts all of us. And so that's what they picked. Assessments take too long. So we still are, everybody's still really focused on themselves, and we're not the greatest team yet, but they have reached an agreement. Big step forward. They've reached an agreement. So the next step is to say, so what exactly does a better assessment mean to each discipline? It's too big of a step to say, what does a better assessment mean to the team? That step is too large. All right, we want to take it in small steps. So what does a better assessment mean to each discipline? And so again, we used did this in a visual modeling tool, and you could easily do this in QualiWare. And we had a look. For each discipline, they came up with this map of what does it mean to them. And so when we looked at, particularly from the assess process point of view, what would a better assessment mean? Each discipline drafted their own view. Then each discipline presented their view to the others. And this is an amazing side benefit of using visual models, enterprise architecture, is that as people presented their view, they referred to their diagram, as opposed to saying, well, I feel this and this happens to me, and this is what we wish you would do different, all the things that they had trouble saying before. That were too personal, and they didn't want to offend people. But now they had this diagram, they could explain, well, on this diagram, we came up with this, and this is what we want to present. It depersonalized it, and it actually enabled them to share and listen in a way that they never had before. To understand, there was some significant understanding that occurred as they listened to other people explain their diagram, because everyone was looking at the diagram, not looking at so much at each other, and so defenses were down. They discussed their differences in ideal experience. No one had ever shared really what their ideal experience was before. And so this enabled that conversation. So what are we doing here? We're building team. We're building a mechanism for them to be able to talk as a team. And they ended up reaching consent. What outcomes will we achieve, and what will we change? So now we've talked about everybody's individual view. We've got that little step, and everybody has understood everyone else, which no one had that understanding before. So now everyone actually has a much bigger, clearer picture of the challenge, the impacts of the challenge, and also what people's ideal experience is. So they're able to talk about now what are the outcomes we want to achieve, and then what will we change? And so again, we did another visual model, which we built over time, and we started with the outcomes. And we started initially with the direct outcomes for each, again, taking small steps, the direct outcomes for each stakeholder. So, what's going to be better for the nurses? What's going to be better for the occupational therapist? That's essentially what direct outcomes are. What's going to be better, right? So you can see that many of them, if you were able to read this, I was very small. Many of them said, well, it's going to be actually less time to do the assessment if we have a common assessment, because a lot of us do the part of the same assessment over and over. So for everyone, it's going to be less time to do the assessment. That was kind of their initial thought. And so they said, well, let's make that as a team outcome, less time to do the assessment. And then the nurses piped up and said, well, in actual fact, we have a very streamlined assessment already, and what we assess, no one else does. So it's not going to be less time for us. So fine, all right. So we're not going to put it in team outcomes. We're going to leave it in direct outcomes. Less time to do the assessment. In actual fact, the physicians don't do an assessment, so it's not meaningful for them. And the recreation therapists don't do an assessment either, but they felt they might actually be able to be involved now. So that turned out to be a good conversation. So we've got an idea now of what's going to be the benefit for everyone, and everyone can understand that for everyone. It's really easy to see, and everyone is feeling heard because their benefit is there and documented. Well, now we were able to talk about team outcomes. What's going to be the benefit for the team? And what was interesting about this was as they talked about outcomes, and I'm just going to explode up those outcomes a little bit. As they talked about those team outcomes, those outcomes actually became the reference for the reference point for the scope of the change. So one of their outcomes was we will have a common language and everybody's going to use the FIM, which is the functional independence measure. We're all going to use it. They agreed. At this point, some of them were using it, some of them weren't. They all were using their own discipline's assessment language. And so by agreeing that this will be a team outcome, they are actually all committing to changing their own way of working, changing their own behavior. Nobody has told them, the manager hasn't come down and told them, you're all going to use a common language now, and, two people are going to go away and we'll come up with the common language, which is what had happened before and hadn't worked. It's actually now an actual team agreement, which means the team owns it, everyone owns it, and they'll be committed to make it happen. This one at the end, stronger team cohesiveness. Everyone wanted that, and they are now believing that they can achieve that because they have started to experience achieving it through using these small steps, focusing on themselves first, then coming as a team, focus on themselves, coming as a team, and building one combined model, building some of their little own models, and then building one big combined model. It is now theirs. It is documented. People can see what they have said. It's very easy for people to see that, this is what I said. This is what I said would be a direct outcome. This is, I'm participating in this process. I don't participate in that process. It's very clear. Everyone can see it at a glance. Nobody has to read through multiple pages of reports. Here's the scope of our change. So then the next step, we've now framed it. How are we actually going to make this happen? How will we design, build, and test this common assessment? So again, back to using Agile principles. Break it into small pieces. Each discipline will draft their own section. The nurses will draft the summary section. Then the team's going to review and revise it. And then we're going to actually use it for 5 patients. We're going to create an MVP. Right? We will create an MVP and we will use it for 5 patients, which will take, I think, about 4 weeks. So again, and each one of these activities was time boxed. So we didn't use sprints. but every activity was time boxed. Everyone had a time to draft their own section. There was a time allotted for doing the team review. They were going to use the draft for 5 patients, which would probably be over about 3 weeks. They would review and revise it, and then, only then, would they assess what was the technology that we should use. So when they did their MVP, they debated whether to use Microsoft Forms or Word, and they eventually went with Word in Teams because they'd just gotten Teams and they could create a folder, put their 5 assessments for their 5 patients in there, pretty easy to manage. So they went with a very, very basic technology so that they could focus on the business value. So again, using Agile Principles to create and actually use their MVP and give everybody comfort that, we're just doing it for 5 patients. We don't have to get this correct. It doesn't have to be right. We will draft it. We'll draft the best we can in the time, then we'll use it, then we'll revise it. Very different way of working for them. And in addition to this, as they went through this process, the value became much larger in their minds and what turned out to be much greater than the cost. The reward went up, the effort went down. Nobody had to read any documents. It was all done through visual modeling in small steps. No, day-long workshops or anything like that. In as little as 10-minute meetings sometimes. Within regular team meetings, within breaks and shifts, small frequent activities, so very much agile, structured visual models, so not pretty pictures, structured models, following a notation, on the basic principles of enterprise architecture, time-boxed outputs, draft, test, learn, getting on with working for fast benefit. Reserve judgment in terms of is this perfect or not. Let's just actually start getting some working benefit from this. They co-created their MVP. And so they reaped a lot of rewards during the change process, which is what started bringing up that scale. So again, you don't have to bring up the scale at the beginning necessarily. That scale of rewards will shift through the process. So the effort starts getting less, the weight of the effort starts getting less, the weight of the reward starts getting more, and that's just a rolling ball of commitment. So they ended up less effort, more reward. So using Agile, using enterprise architecture, and weaving in change management into the whole process to take the best of Agile and the best of enterprise architecture, we actually enabled this group of people to overcome a fairly significant roadblock to transformation. And almost everyone was involved in envisioning and determining, in figuring out why and what they were going to change as part of Frame the Future. They used tools and involved people in ways that fit their unique working environments. This enabled people to focus in quickly on the important points and helped create deeper understanding of how each group fit in the larger picture and together. This empowered them to start to overcome their own resistance and to collaboratively plot their path to transformation. In addition, success in framing the future together started to build their trust that they could be successful in making this change happen.